Some NBA coaches yelled at refs, some yelled at the media, and some looked at their own players and said, yeah, let me ruin this man publicly. So today, we're looking at NBA coaches who humiliated their own players.
Stan Van Gundy and Dwight Howard. This one still feels fake when you watch it back. By 2012, the relationship between Stan Van Gundy and Dwight Howard already felt shaky. Dwight was the franchise guy. Stan was blunt, direct, and never really cared about soft delivery. That works when you're winning. Once things start slipping, man, every little comment feels personal. Then, on April 5th, 2012, everything blew up in public. Stan Van Gundy was talking to reporters before a game, just regular media stuff. Then he said he knew Dwight Howard wanted him fired. He said people in Orlando's management told him it was true.
When it comes out that one of the highest profile guys in the league has, asked for, his coach to be fired, I mean, it's going to be a story.
And how do you know it's true?
I was told it was true by people in our management.
That is already crazy. A head coach publicly saying his own superstar wants him gone is wild enough. But the timing made it way worse. Because literally, moments later, Dwight walked into the interview. He stepped right up next to Stan and put his arm around him like they were best friends.
Stan looked like a man trapped inside a terrible skit. Dwight said something like, "We're not worried about that, right?" Stan answered him, but the whole thing felt dead. No warmth, no real chemistry, just pure discomfort floating in the air.
Dwight later talked about it, years after the moment. He said that day was the worst day of his life. He said he was shocked. He said people told him to go put his arm around Stan so everybody would think they were okay, which somehow makes it even more uncomfortable. And to make it even uglier, Orlando lost that night 96-80 to the Knicks. Dwight had just 8 points and 8 rebounds. So the whole day became this giant mess. Then the game itself was bad too. Stan Van Gundy got fired on May 21, 2012. Dwight got traded that August. But look, as awkward as Stan and Dwight were, Phil Jackson somehow made things even stranger. Phil Jackson is one of those coaches people almost treat like a basketball philosopher. Zen master, triangle offense, championship rings everywhere. So when Phil did something weird, people usually tried to make it sound deeper than it was. This was not deep. This was just weird, man. Back in December 2005, Kwame Brown was dealing with a moderate right hamstring strain. He was still recovering and had already gone beyond the initial 2-week recovery estimate. So he was hurt, trying to get right, and probably already frustrated. Then Phil decided to talk. Reports came out that Jackson had publicly mocked Kwame as basically being soft. That already sounds bad. Then Phil later clarified what he meant, and the clarification honestly sounded crazier than the original story. He said he and assistant coach Brian Shaw had been making cat sounds at Kwame, like literally meowing when they walked past him. Phil tried to explain it away. He said Brian Shaw started it first. He said Kwame laughed. He said it was a joke. He said injured players get teased in the NBA all the time. Then he added that Kwame worked hard, showed up early, did all the therapy work, and wasn't avoiding anything. Which is nice. But once the public hears the meowing part, it's over. Nobody remembers the supportive paragraph after that. They remember that Phil Jackson turned rehab into a cat bit. And with Kwame, the whole thing felt uglier because he was already one of the easiest players in the league to clown. Everything he did got exaggerated. Every weakness got turned into a character flaw. So when the coach joins in publicly, it stops feeling like motivation and starts feeling like bullying. That's what separates hard coaching from humiliation. Hard coaching says get better. Humiliation says everybody come look at this guy. And for Kwame, that kind of public embarrassment was always going to stick. Not because it was the biggest scandal ever, but because it was so stupid, so random, so unnecessary. And honestly, if your coach is making animal noises at you while you're hurt, the relationship is already finished. But if Phil gave us weird, George Karl gave us pure bitterness. George Karl versus Carmelo Anthony J.R. Smith and Kenyon Martin. George Karl didn't just call players out in a moment. He waited, he sat on it. Then he wrote a book and started firing shots like he had 6 years of resentment saved in drafts. And man, he did not hold back. Karl coached Carmelo Anthony in Denver from January 2005 to February 2011. That was a long run. Plenty of wins, plenty of talent, plenty of drama too. Years later, Karl described Melo in his book as a true conundrum. Then he kept going. He said Melo was a user of people. He said Melo was addicted to the spotlight. He said he had a low demand of himself on defense. That is not normal old coach criticism. That is personal. And then George made it worse by spreading the heat around. He also took shots at Kenyon Martin and J.R. Smith. He compared Melo, J.R., and Kenyon to spoiled brats. Then he said Melo and Kenyon had been negatively affected by not having fathers to show them how to act like men. That is the kind of line where you read it once and immediately think, yeah, this is going to be a problem. Because now it's not basketball anymore. Now it's not even leadership talk. Now it's one old coach deciding to psychoanalyze grown men in public. Melo responded in a way that was actually colder than yelling. He basically said it was irrelevant. He hoped George found happiness from the book. That is one of those responses that sounds polite, but it's really a funeral. J.R. Smith kept it shorter. He said George was still trying to be relevant, which, honestly, that was the exact vibe. Kenyon Martin was the one who really let it fly. He went to Twitter and started cooking George immediately. He called him awful, cowardly, selfish, miserable. He said the book was full of lies and deceit. He called him the worst coach he ever played for. And the whole thing got even messier when reports said some critical passages about George Karl's King stint were removed from the final version of the book. So even the book apparently needed edits to lower the toxicity. That is insane, man. Imagine writing so recklessly that the final product has to come in and save you from yourself. That's why this one felt especially humiliating. George wasn't correcting players. He wasn't trying to help them improve. He was using the authority of being the former coach to throw dirt on their names years later. And once a coach does that, it hits differently because coaches always know things the public doesn't. Now, the saddest story here might be Darko. Larry Brown and Darko Miličić. Darko Miličić came into the NBA with pressure that already felt ridiculous. Detroit took him with the number 2 pick in the 2003 draft, and right behind him were Carmelo Anthony, Chris Bosh, and Dwayne Wade. That alone is brutal. Even if Darko became decent, people were always going to compare him to 3 future stars. That's already a terrible setup. But Larry Brown made it feel even worse. Years later, Brown talked about the draft process and said Darko had struggled through 2 workouts with Detroit. Brown said he wanted Carmelo brought in. He basically made it sound like Darko was never really his guy. And man, imagine hearing that as Darko. You're the 2nd pick in the whole draft. You come into the league thinking your coach believes in you. Then later, it basically sounds like the coach wanted somebody else from the start. That is brutal for confidence. Especially for a teenager coming from another country into a veteran team trying to win immediately. And then the playing time made the humiliation public. As a rookie, Darko appeared in only 34 games. He averaged 4.7 minutes and 1.4 points. That's not development. That's a witness program. So now every game becomes the same story. Carmelo is doing big things. Bosh is talented. Wade is exploding. And Darko is sitting there, barely playing, with the entire basketball world deciding he's a bust before he even gets a chance to breathe. That's what made his situation feel so ugly. He wasn't just struggling. He was struggling under public comparison every single night. And the coach clearly didn't seem interested in building him up through it.